Imagine a year when the sun disappeared, crops failed, cities were engulfed by famine, and a deadly plague wiped out millions. This wasn't fiction. It happened in 536 AD. What caused the sky to go dark and changed human history forever? Please subscribe my channel. Imagine waking up one morning and looking toward the sky, only to find that the sun no longer shines as it should. Not completely gone. Not completely dark. Just dim. Weak. Cold. A pale disk hanging behind a strange gray veil. At first, people might have thought it was simply a cloudy day. But then the next day arrived, and the sun still looked wrong. The light felt thin and distant, like the last fading glow of evening. Days passed. Then weeks. Across vast regions of the world, farmers, travelers, soldiers, and villagers began to whisper the same uneasy question. What happened to the sun? The year was 536 AD. In the long story of human history, few years have earned such a dark reputation. Historians today sometimes call it the worst year to be alive ***. But for the people who lived through it, there was no dramatic announcement, no explanation from scientists, no news carried across continents. There was only confusion and fear. The Roman world was already changing rapidly. The once mighty Western Roman Empire had fallen decades earlier, leaving behind a patchwork of kingdoms. In the East, the empire still survived under the rule of Justinian I, whose ambition was to restore Roman power. Cities like Constantinople still glowed with wealth and marble splendor. Trade ships crossed the Mediterranean. Scholars studied ancient books. But even in this powerful empire, people depended on something simple and ancient. Sunlight. Sunlight warmed the fields where wheat grew. Sunlight ripened olives and grapes. Sunlight kept the rhythm of season that farmers had trusted for thousands of years. Without the sun, everything would change. And in 536 AD, something began to block the light. The earliest clues come from ancient writers who recorded what they saw. One of them was Procopius, a historian who lived during the reign of Justinian. He described something deeply unsettling. According to him, the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon during an eclipse. Day after day, the sky remained dim and strange. Another writer, Cassiodorus, wrote about the same phenomenon in Italy. His letters described a world where shadows looked faint, crops struggled to grow, and the seasons seemed confused. He wrote that the sun appeared bluish. The air felt cold, and people could not tell whether it was truly day. Imagine living in that world. Every morning you wake up, expecting the warm, golden sunlight that has guided humanity since the beginning of time. Instead, you see a dull gray sky. Your crops grow slowly. The air feels colder than it should. Even at noon, the light feels like evening. At first, people searched for explanations that made sense in their beliefs. Some thought it was a warning from God. Others believed it was a sign of divine punishment. In many cultures, strange events in the sky were often connected to prophecy or the anger of the heavens. But the truth was far more mysterious. Across Europe, across the Middle East, and even far away in Asia, the same strange darkness was appearing. Records from the Byzantine world described dim sunlight. Chronicles from China spoke of unusual frost and summer snow. In some places, crops began to fail, and hunger slowly crept into villages and cities. No one knew it yet, But the world had entered the beginning of a *** global climate disaster**. Today, scientists believe the cause may have been a massive volcanic eruption, possibly even several eruptions occurring close together. Some researchers suspect volcanoes in regions like Iceland may have exploded with tremendous force. When volcanoes erupt on a massive scale, they throw enormous amounts of ash and sulfur gas high into the atmosphere. These particles spread across the sky and block sunlight. The result is a kind of natural sunshade around the planet. Temperatures drop, seasons become unpredictable, and crops fail. But in 536 AD, people had no understanding of volcanoes on this scale. Most had never even seen one. To them, the darkened sun was a mystery, a cosmic riddle written across the sky. In villages across Europe, farmers watched their fields nervously. Wheat sprouted slowly. Fruit trees struggled. The warmth of spring never fully arrived. Summer felt strangely cold, and the sun continued to shine weakly through the haze. Travelers carried news from one region to another. Everywhere they went, the same stories appeared. Dim skies, cold winds, strange weather. It was as if the world itself had slipped into a long twilight. And this twilight would not end quickly. The darkness lasted not just for weeks or months, but for years. In Ireland, ancient chronicles later recorded a chilling phrase: a failure of bread. Those three simple words described a terrible reality. When crops fail, food disappears. When food disappears, famine begins. Families that once lived comfortably suddenly faced empty storage jars. Grain reserves ran out. Livestock weakened, and hunger began to spread quietly through the countryside. Cities felt the effects too. Even powerful empires depended on the harvest. Grain shipments that once filled warehouses grew smaller. Prices rose. People worried about what the next winter would bring. For ordinary villagers, life became a daily struggle. Each morning they scanned the sky, hoping the strange gray veil might finally clear. But the sun remained dim, and the cold remained stubborn. Many must have wondered if the world itself was ending. After all, if the sun could lose its power, what else might fail? Yet even as the skies remained dark, humanity continued its ordinary routines. Farmers planted crops. Merchants traveled dusty roads. Priests prayed. Children were born. Life moved forward, even in uncertainty. But beneath the surface of daily life, a silent chain reaction had begun. The weakened sunlight was changing the climate of the entire planet. Harvests were shrinking. Food supplies were tightening. And the stage was quietly being set for something even more devastating. Because only a few years after the sun first dimmed, another disaster would strike. One that would spread across continents. One that would kill millions. A disease that history would remember as the terrifying plague of Justinian ****. The strange dimming of the sun did not vanish after a few days. Weeks passed, then months, and the sky still carried that pale, ghostly light. Across much of the known world, people began to realize that something far beyond ordinary weather was happening. In the eastern half of the old Roman world, the great empire centered around Constantinople continued its daily life. But even there, the change in the sky was impossible to ignore. The city was one of the largest in the world, crowded with merchants, sailors, soldiers, and officials serving the Emperor Justinian I. Constantinople was used to spectacle. Its great harbor filled with ships from Egypt, Syria, and beyond. Its enormous churches glittered with gold mosaics, but nothing in the city's history had prepared its people for a sun that seemed to fade like a dying flame. At midday the light felt weak, almost bluish. Shadows on the streets looked faint and blurred. The warmth that normally soaked the marble walls of buildings seemed to vanish. Merchants walking through the markets noticed something strange. Even when the sky appeared clear, the brightness never fully returned. It felt as if a thin veil hung over the entire world. Far away in Italy, the scholar and statesman Cassiodorus described the same unsettling sight. Writing letters to officials, he tried to explain what everyone was experiencing. He spoke of a sun that gave light without warmth. He wrote that the sky had lost its clear blue color. The seasons themselves seemed confused. Normally, spring would bring fresh warmth to the fields. Crops would grow quickly under the bright sunlight. Farmers would watch their wheat turn from green to gold. But in this strange year, spring arrived weak and cold. Fields that should have been vibrant looked dull and thin. Seeds sprouted slowly. Some crops never fully grew. The strange climate continued through the summer. People expected the sun to grow stronger as the months passed. Instead, the dim light remained. In some places, temperatures dropped far lower than normal. Reports from distant lands spoke of frost, appearing at times when frost should have been impossible. Even in regions that normally enjoyed warm weather, the air felt unusually cool. Farmers began to worry. Agriculture had always been a delicate balance between sunlight, rain, and temperature. If any of these changed too much, the harvest could fail. And if the harvest failed, hunger would soon follow. For the people of the 6th century, food security depended almost entirely on the success of each year's crops. There were no global food shipments, no refrigerated storage, and no modern farming technology. If the fields did poorly, entire communities could suffer. In Northern Europe, villages that relied heavily on grain began to notice smaller harvests. The heads of wheat were thin. Barley fields produced less grain than usual. Farmers gathered what they could, but the amount stored for winter looked smaller than it should have been. Across the Mediterranean world, similar stories appeared. Even the fertile lands of Egypt, which normally produced enormous amounts of grain for the Byzantine Empire, began to face unpredictable conditions. The Nile River had always been the lifeline of Egypt. Each year its floods watered the fields and made farming possible. But the strange climate seemed to disrupt everything. Unusual weather patterns confused the ancient rhythm that farmers depended on. When harvests shrank, the consequences moved quickly through society. Grain prices began to rise. Merchants who traded food noticed shortages forming in different regions. Warehouses that should have been full began to empty faster than expected. In cities, poor families struggled first. Bread became harder to afford. Bakers sometimes reduced the size of their loaves to stretch limited supplies. In villages, the signs of trouble appeared quietly. A farmer might open his grain storage and realize there would not be enough to last the winter. A family might decide to slaughter animals earlier than usual because they could not afford to feed them. These small decisions revealed a growing fear. People did not yet know how long the strange, dim sunlight would last, but they could see its effects spreading across the land. Meanwhile, travelers carried stories from distant regions, and those stories only deepened the mystery. In the Far East, records from China described unusual weather and strange celestial events. Some chronicles mentioned summer snow and widespread crop damage. The same dimming sun that worried farmers in Europe was also being noticed thousands of miles away. It was becoming clear that whatever had happened in the sky was not local. It was global. Today, scientists believe that enormous volcanic eruptions may have filled the upper atmosphere with ash and sulfur particles. These particles reflected sunlight back into space, reducing the amount of heat reaching the Earth. But in the 6th century, people had no knowledge of atmospheric science. To them, the darkened sun felt supernatural. Priests and religious leaders often interpreted the strange sky as a warning from heaven. Some preached that humanity had angered God. Others saw it as a sign that the end of the world might be approaching. Throughout history, sudden changes in the sky have often been seen as omens. Eclipses, comets, and unusual lights could spark fear among entire populations. But the event of 536 was far more terrifying because it did not last a few minutes or hours. It continued day after day, month after month. A strange twilight seemed to stretch across the world. People could still see the sun, but it felt distant and weak. Even in the middle of the day, the brightness never fully returned. Artists and historians later described the sky as dull or gray, like a permanent haze. Imagine walking through a village under that kind of sky. The light is dim. The air is cold. The crops are struggling. And no one knows why. Fear grows slowly in such conditions. Not sudden panic, but a creeping uncertainty that settles into daily life. People begin to wonder whether the next harvest will fail completely. Parents worry about feeding their children. Communities begin to pray more often, hoping the strange darkness will finally end. Yet the dim sun remained. Another year approached. And as winter drew closer, the true consequences of the weakened sunlight began to appear. The harvests of 536 had already been poor. If the following year was also cold and dim, the food shortages could become far worse. For a fragile world dependent on agriculture, even 2 bad harvests in a row could be devastating. Unfortunately, the sky did not return to normal. Instead, the climate continued to behave strangely. And as the world struggled with cold summers and weak sunlight, another shadow began to move quietly through history. It was not visible in the sky. It was not carried by clouds. It traveled with ships, caravans, and rats hiding in the shadows of human settlements. Within a few years, a disease would spread across continents, killing millions of people. Historians would later name it after the emperor who ruled during its arrival. The terrifying plague of Justinian. But before the disease appeared, the world first had to endure the cold, hungry years created by the fatting sun. And the darkness in the sky was only the beginning. As the strange dim sunlight continued into the following seasons, the people of the 6th century slowly realized that this was not a passing disturbance. The sky had changed in a way that no living person had ever seen before. In many places, the sunlight felt permanently weakened. Even on days when the sky appeared clear, the brightness remained dull and muted. Travelers often described the light as pale and cold, like the glow of the moon rather than the warmth of the sun. Across Europe, farmers began to observe the most troubling signs in their fields. Seeds that normally sprouted quickly now struggled in the cold soil. Crops grew slowly and unevenly. Some plants simply failed to mature at all. The rhythm of agriculture had always depended on predictable seasons. Spring warmed the ground. Summer ripened the harvest. Autumn brought the gathering of food for winter. But after the mysterious darkening of the sun in 536, those rhythms seemed to break apart. Spring arrived late. Summer felt unusually cold. And the harvests grew weaker with every passing month. In the Byzantine world, the historian Procopius continued to record the strange conditions affecting the empire. His writings described a sun that appeared dim and powerless, as if its strength had faded. For the people living in the cities and villages of the empire, this change created constant anxiety. Food was the foundation of stability. As long as grain shipments arrived and markets remained full, society could function. But once food supplies began to shrink, fear spread quickly. In the great city of Constantinople, enormous numbers of people depended on grain imports from distant provinces. Ships carried wheat from the fertile lands of Egypt and North Africa to feed the crowded population of the capital. If those harvests failed, the consequences could be disastrous. For centuries, Roman governments had worked hard to maintain stable grain supplies. Bread was not simply food, it was the lifeline of the city. Now that lifeline was beginning to weaken. Merchants arriving at the harbors brought troubling news. Some regions had experienced poor harvests. In other areas, the cold weather had damaged crops before they could mature. The empire still possessed reserves, but the uncertainty made officials uneasy. Meanwhile, far beyond the Mediterranean world, other civilizations were experiencing similar struggles. Chinese historical records from the same period describe severe climatic disruptions. Some chronicles report unusual snowfall during summer months and widespread agricultural problems. The strange dimming of the sun was affecting climates across vast distances. It was becoming clear that this was not a local disaster. It was global. Today, scientists studying ice cores from ancient glaciers have found traces of volcanic material dating to this period. These tiny particles trapped in ice suggest that enormous volcanic eruptions may have sent ash and sulfur high into the atmosphere. When such material spreads around the planet, it can block sunlight and cool the Earth. The result is what modern scientists call a volcanic winter. But for the people living in the 6th century, the idea of volcanic winters did not exist. Most of them had never seen a volcano. Many probably did not even know such mountains could erupt with such force. To them, the strange sky remained a mystery. In rural villages, farmers tried to adapt as best they could. They planted crops earlier or later, hopping to match the unpredictable weather. Some communities relied more heavily on livestock when crops failed. Others searched forests for wild food such as berries, nuts, and roots. But these solutions could only help for so long. As the weakened sunlight continued, food shortages slowly turned into famine in some regions. The Irish annals recorded grim evidence of this hardship. Chroniclers writing years later described a period when there was a failure of bread. Those simple words reveal how severe the situation had become. Without bread, the most basic food of daily life disappeared. Families began to ration what little grain they had saved. Meals became smaller. Hunger became a familiar companion. For poorer families, survival often meant making difficult choices. Some slaughtered animals that they would normally keep for breeding or future food supplies. Others traded valuable possessions in exchange for small amounts of grain. And in extreme cases, entire communities abandoned their homes in search of better land. Migration was one of humanity's oldest responses to environmental crisis. When the land could no longer provide enough food, people moved. Small groups traveled along ancient roads, searching for regions where crops might still grow. But many found that the strange climate had spread across large areas. The dim sun followed them wherever they went. Even the forests felt different. Trees grew slowly. The air remained cool, even during the warmest months. And the sky continued to carry that thin gray veil. While ordinary people struggled with hunger and uncertainty, rulers and governments faced a different kind of challenge. Empires depended on stability. Taxes, armies, and trade all relied on a functioning agricultural system. When harvests failed, the entire political structure could weaken. Emperor Justinian I was already dealing with enormous responsibilities. He was attempting to rebuild the old Roman Empire through military campaigns in Italy and North Africa. These wars required vast resources. Soldiers needed food. Armies needed supplies. If the empire's agricultural base weakened, those ambitions could become impossible. At the same time, the people themselves were becoming more anxious. Whenever natural disasters occurred in the ancient world, many believed they carried religious meaning. Priests and religious leaders often interpreted unusual events as signs of divine judgment. The dim sun, the cold summers, and the failing harvests seemed to confirm those fears. Churches filled with people praying for mercy. Communities held special religious ceremonies, hoping to persuade heaven to restore the natural order. Some individuals believed the end of the world might be near. After all, if the sun itself could fade, what other disasters might follow? Yet despite all these fears, daily life continued. Markets still opened. Children still played in village streets. Farmers still rose early each morning to tend their struggling fields. Human beings have always shown remarkable resilience, even in the face of uncertainty. But beneath that resilience, the pressure continued to build. Food shortages were spreading. Cold seasons were repeating. And the weakened sun still hung in the sky. What no one realized yet was that these harsh conditions were creating the perfect environment for another catastrophe. Famine weakens populations. Cold weather drives animals closer to human settlements. Trade routes carry goods, and sometimes hidden dangers across continents. Within a few years, ships traveling through the eastern Mediterranean would carry something far more terrifying than grain or silk. A disease that had been quietly moving through distant lands would soon arrive in the heart of the Byzantine world. When it reached the great city of Constantinople, it would unleash one of the deadliest pandemics in ancient history. And the weakened world created by the dim sun would be far less prepared to resist it. The disaster of 536 had begun with darkness in the sky. But its consequences were only just beginning to unfold. As the strange dim sun continued to hang above the world, people slowly realized that the disaster was not limited to a single bad harvest. The years following 536 became a time of uncertainty, when the climate itself seemed unstable. In many regions, the temperature remained colder than expected. Summers never fully warmed the soil, and winters felt longer and harsher. For societies that depended almost entirely on agriculture, this shift in climate carried serious consequences. Farmers throughout Europe began to face a pattern that frightened them deeply. Even when crops grew, the harvests were smaller. Fields that once produced strong yields now struggled to support entire communities. Grain was the foundation of daily survival. Wheat and barley were used to make bread, porridge, and other basic foods. Without a reliable supply of grain, the food system began to weaken. The people living in the countryside felt these changes first. Rural villages often had little protection against poor harvests. A few bad seasons could drain their food reserves completely. When supplies ran low, families had to stretch every meal. Bread was baked thinner. Portions were reduced. Children often received the largest share while adults quietly ate less. But even these sacrifices could not prevent hunger forever. In some areas, famine slowly appeared. The word famine does not always mean immediate starvation. Often it begins quietly, as a long period of food shortage that weakens communities over time. People grow thinner. Illness spreads more easily. The elderly and the very young become especially vulnerable. The strange sky above them only deepened the fear. Day after day, the sunlight remained dull and pale. Even in the brightest hours of midday, the warmth felt weak. Many people had never seen such a sky before. Across the Mediterranean world, the powerful empire ruled by Justinian I was attempting to maintain stability despite these growing problems. Justinian had enormous ambitions. He dreamed of restoring the ancient power of Rome by reconquering lost territories. His armies had already begun campaigns to reclaim parts of the former Western Roman Empire. But war required resources. Soldiers needed food. Cities needed supplies. And the empire depended on a steady flow of grain from distant agricultural regions. One of the most important sources of grain was Egypt, whose fertile land along the Nile had fed the Roman world for centuries. The annual flooding of the Nile normally created rich farmland that produced huge harvests. But the strange climate of the late 530s disrupted even this reliable system. Flood patterns became less predictable. Agricultural planning became more difficult. Although Egypt continued to produce grain, the uncertainty worried imperial officials. In the capital city of Constantinople, large government warehouses stored grain for the population. These reserves helped protect the city from sudden shortages. But officials understood that if poor harvests continued for several years, even those reserves might eventually run out. Merchants arriving at the city's ports brought troubling news from other regions. In parts of Europe, food shortages had already become severe. Some villages reported abandoned farms where families had moved away in search of better conditions. Migration slowly increased during these years. Groups of people traveled along ancient trade routes, hopping to find land where crops still grew well. But the unusual climate stretched across vast distances. Travelers often discovered that other regions were facing similar problems. In the northern lands of Europe, cold weather shortened the growing season. Crops had less time to mature before the arrival of autumn frosts. Further south, unusual weather patterns damaged fruit trees and vineyards. These problems did not destroy agriculture completely, but they weakened it everywhere. The world seemed to have entered a long period of instability. Ancient writers continued to record the strange events surrounding them. The historian Procopius wrote that the sun appeared dim and without strength. To modern readers, these descriptions may sound dramatic, but for the people living at the time, the experience must have been deeply unsettling. The sun had always been the most reliable element of nature. It rose each morning. It warmed the land. It guided the seasons. But now that dependable light seemed uncertain. Even animals behaved differently during these years. Cold temperatures and food shortages affected wildlife just as much as human communities. In some regions, animals moved closer to villages in search of food. Farmers sometimes reported seeing unusual patterns of animal migration. Livestock also suffered when pasture lands grew poorly. Cattle, sheep, and goats depended on healthy grasslands, which struggled under the colder climate. When animals weakened, another problem emerged. People often relied on livestock not only for meat, but also for milk, wool, and labor. If animals died or became unhealthy, the entire rural economy suffered. Every part of life was connected to the health of the land. And the land itself was struggling under the dim sky. Despite these hardships, human societies continued to function. Trade still moved across continents. Ships still crossed the Mediterranean Sea carrying goods between distant ports. Caravans traveled along ancient routes, connecting the Middle East with Asia. These trade networks were one of the great achievements of ancient civilization. They allowed cultures to exchange goods, ideas, and knowledge. But trade routes could also carry invisible dangers. Among the cargo of grain, silk, and spices, sometimes traveled small creatures hiding in the shadows. Rats, and within those rats lived tiny parasites that could carry deadly disease. At first, no one noticed anything unusual. The ships arriving in ports looked the same as always. Their holds were filled with goods from distant lands. Sailors unloaded cargo and merchants negotiated prices in crowded markets. Life in great cities like Constantinople continued with its usual noise and activity. Yet somewhere far beyond the city, a deadly infection had already begun its journey. In regions near the Red Sea and East Africa, a disease was spreading quietly among rodents. Fleas feeding on infected animals carried the bacteria from host to host. As trade ships moved between ports, rats often traveled with them, hidden among cargo and supplies. Slowly, almost invisibly, the disease moved along the same trade routes that had once carried prosperity. The weakened world created by years of cold weather and famine would soon face a new threat. A threat that would strike suddenly and violently. Within only a few years, the great empire of Justinian I would experience a catastrophe that none of its citizens could have imagined. The darkened sun had already changed the climate of the planet. Now another disaster was preparing to change the course of history itself. A plague that would sweep across cities, villages, and empires. A disease that historians would later call the Plague of Justinian. And when it arrived, the struggling world of the late 530s would be forced to face its greatest test. By the late 530s, the strange years that followed the dimming of the sun had begun to reshape the world in quiet but powerful ways. Harvests had grown weaker. Winters had felt longer. Communities had struggled with hunger and uncertainty. Yet even as people worried about food and weather, the greater danger moving across the world remained unseen. Disease had always existed in ancient societies. Small outbreaks of illness appeared from time to time, spreading through towns and villages before fading away. But what was beginning to move along the trade routes of the 6th century was something far more deadly. The infection had likely started far to the south, in regions connected to the trade networks of East Africa and the Red Sea. Merchants and sailors traveled constantly between ports, carrying goods that linked distant civilizations. Ships loaded with grain, cloth, spices, and precious materials moved across the waters of the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean. But ships also carried passengers that no merchant intended to transport. Rats. These small animals had lived alongside human settlements for thousands of years. They thrived in places where food was stored, especially in warehouses, ships, and markets. Inside the fur of these rats lived fleas. And those fleas sometimes carried a dangerous bacterium that could infect humans. At first, the disease spread quietly among rodent populations near trade centers. Rats living in ports or storage areas passed the infection from one group to another. When infected rats died, hungry fleas searched for new hosts. Sometimes those hosts were humans. The disease they carried would later be known as bubonic plague, one of the most feared illnesses in history. Centuries later, the same disease would devastate Europe during the Black Death. But in the 6th century, the world had never experienced such a catastrophe before. The first signs of the coming disaster appeared around the early 540s. Reports of a strange and deadly sickness began to spread through trade networks connected to the Red Sea and the Eastern Mediterranean. At first, these reports seemed distant, like rumors from faraway lands. Merchants arriving in ports spoke about towns where people were suddenly falling ill. Victims developed painful swellings in their bodies. High fever followed. Many died within days. But the world of the 6th century was vast, and news traveled slowly. Few people understood how quickly such a disease could move along the busy trade routes. Ships continued to sail. Caravans continued to cross deserts and mountains. And the invisible chain of infection continued to grow. Meanwhile, the Byzantine Empire, ruled by Justinian I, remained one of the most powerful states on earth. Justinian's armies were fighting to reclaim lost Roman territories in Italy and North Africa. His generals had already achieved major victories, restoring imperial control over regions that had been lost for decades. The emperor believed he was rebuilding the glory of ancient Rome. The capital city of Constantinople stood at the center of this grand vision. It was one of the largest and richest cities in the world. Its massive walls protected hundreds of thousands of residents. Great churches and palaces dominated the skyline. Among them stood the magnificent Hagia Sophia, a structure so vast and beautiful that visitors often felt overwhelmed when they stepped inside. The city's harbors bustled with activity. Ships arrived daily carrying goods from Egypt, Syria, and beyond. Markets filled with merchants selling food, cloth, metal tools, spices, and countless other products. To the people living in Constantinople, the world still seemed strong and prosperous. But the conditions created by the dim sun years had quietly weakened many societies. Food shortages had strained communities. Cold weather had reduced harvests. Malnutrition had made populations more vulnerable to illness. And the crowded streets of great cities provided the perfect environment for disease to spread. When the plague finally reached the eastern Mediterranean, it moved quickly. Ports were especially vulnerable. Ships arriving from infected regions sometimes carried rats hiding among the cargo. Once these rats entered warehouses or markets, the fleas they carried could spread the infection to local rodent populations. From there, the disease could jump to humans. At first, only a few people became sick. But the illness was terrifying. Victims often developed painful swellings called buboes, usually in the groin, armpits, or neck. These swellings could grow large and dark, signaling severe infection. Fever followed quickly. Some people became delirious. Others fell unconscious. Many died within only a few days. The sudden nature of the disease frightened communities everywhere it appeared. Unlike famine or war, which developed gradually, this sickness struck quickly and unpredictably. A healthy person might wake in the morning feeling fine. By evening, they could be gravely ill. Within days, they might be dead. Rumors of the disease continued to spread through the trade networks of the Mediterranean. But the greatest shock would come when the plague finally reached the most important city in the Byzantine world. The arrival of the disease in Constantinople would transform a frightening epidemic into a full-scale catastrophe. The city's enormous population and crowded streets created the perfect conditions for the infection to explode. Soon thousands of people would fall ill. Hospitals would overflow. Bodies would pile up faster than they could be buried. And even the emperor himself would not escape the shadow of the disease. The dark years that began with the fatting sun in 536 had already shaken the world. But the coming plague would turn those difficult years into one of the greatest disasters of the ancient era. And when it struck the capital of the empire, the people of Constantinople would witness a nightmare unlike anything they had ever known. In the early 540s, ships continued to arrive at the busy harbors of Constantinople just as they had for centuries. Sailors unloaded grain from Egypt, merchants carried crates of goods through crowded docks, and port workers shouted to one another as they moved cargo through the warehouses. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The great capital of the Byzantine Empire had survived wars, political conflicts, and economic struggles. It had always remained a vibrant center of trade and culture. But in the year 541, a silent threat arrived within the city. It likely came aboard one of the many ships traveling through the eastern Mediterranean. Hidden among sacks of grain or inside dark corners of the hull were rats that had traveled long distances across the sea. Inside the fur of those rats lived fleas. And those fleas carried the deadly bacteria responsible for the plague. The first human cases probably appeared quietly. A few people fell ill with strange symptoms that physicians struggled to understand. At first, the illness did not seem different from other diseases common in ancient cities. But the sickness spread rapidly. Victims developed high fevers and painful swellings on their bodies. These swellings often appeared in the groin or under the arms and could grow large and dark. The pain was intense. Many patients quickly became weak and confused. Within days, many of them died. As the number of victims increased, doctors realized that this illness was something far more dangerous than ordinary sickness. Word spread through the crowded neighborhoods of the city. People whispered about a terrible disease moving through the population. Fear began to grow. The Emperor Justinian still ruled from his great palace overlooking the city. He had spent years trying to rebuild the power of the Roman Empire through military victories and ambitious construction projects. His reign had already changed the empire in many ways. Under his leadership, the massive cathedral known as Hagia Sophia had been built, becoming one of the most impressive structures in the world. Its enormous dome seemed to float above the city, a symbol of imperial strength and divine protection. But now the empire faced an enemy that walls and armies could not stop. The plague spread through Constantinople with terrifying speed. Crowded living conditions helped the disease move easily from person to person. Markets, homes, and narrow streets placed thousands of people close together every day. Within weeks, the number of sick residents began to rise dramatically. The historian Procopius later described the chaos that followed. Hospitals quickly became overwhelmed. Doctors struggled to treat the growing number of patients. Some physicians attempted to drain the painful swellings from victims, hoping to remove the infection. Others tried herbal medicines or traditional remedies. But nothing seemed to work. The plague killed without mercy. At the height of the outbreak, thousands of people were dying each day in the capital. Families lost parents, children, and relatives in a matter of days. The streets grew quieter as fear spread across the population. Many people avoided leaving their homes unless absolutely necessary. Markets became less crowded. Shops closed. Even government offices began to lose workers as illness spread among officials. The plague did not spare anyone. Rich and poor, soldiers and merchants, servants and nobles all faced the same danger. Even the emperor himself eventually became ill. For a time, it appeared that Justinian might die from the disease. News of the emperor's illness shocked the empire. If the ruler died during such a crisis, political chaos could follow. But Justinian eventually recovered, surviving the sickness that had killed so many others. For the ordinary people of the city, however, survival was far less certain. The number of deaths soon grew so large that the normal systems for burying the dead collapsed. Cemeteries quickly filled beyond capacity. Workers responsible for burial could not keep up with the constant stream of bodies. Authorities began searching for new solutions. Large pits were dug outside the city walls where bodies could be placed in mass graves. In some cases, abandoned buildings and towers were used to store the dead. Ships were even loaded with corpses and sent out to sea. The scale of death was unlike anything the city had experienced before. Daily life almost completely stopped. Trade slowed dramatically. Food supplies became more difficult to distribute. Many farmers and transport workers had died, weakening the systems that delivered grain to the capital. The disaster was not limited to Constantinople alone. As ships continued to travel between ports, the plague spread throughout the Mediterranean world. Cities in Syria, Egypt, and North Africa soon reported outbreaks of the same deadly illness. From there, the disease moved into Europe and the Middle East. The weakened world that had already struggled through years of strange climate and poor harvests now faced a pandemic. Some communities lost enormous portions of their population. Villages became quiet as entire families disappeared. Fields went untended. Trade networks slowed as merchants avoided infected regions. The empire of Justinian, I suddenly faced a crisis far greater than war or political rivalry. It was a crisis of survival. The dark years that began with the fatting sun in 536 had already weakened societies across the world. Now the plague was turning that weakness into devastation. And as the disease spread across continents, humanity would be forced to confront one of the most deadly pandemics of the ancient era. The dim sky had changed the climate. The famine had weakened populations. And now the plague was reshaping history itself. As the plague tightened its grip on the Byzantine world, the once busy streets of Constantinople began to fall silent. Only months earlier, the city had been filled with the noise of merchants, sailors, and crowds moving through markets and public squares. Now the atmosphere felt completely different. Many homes were closed. Doors remained shut. People stayed inside, hopping to avoid the invisible sickness that seemed to move from house to house without warning. In some neighborhoods, entire families had fallen ill. When one person became infected, others living nearby often became sick soon afterward. Fear spread quickly among the population. People avoided touching strangers. Some even refused to help sick neighbors, afraid that the disease might pass to them. For many citizens, this behavior felt unnatural. Communities in the ancient world usually depended on strong family and social bonds. Helping neighbors and relatives was a normal part of daily life. But during the plague, fear began to replace those traditions. The historian Procopius described scenes of overwhelming tragedy. He wrote about homes where every member of a household had died within a few days. Some victims collapsed suddenly in the streets. Others died alone in their houses before anyone realized they were sick. The number of deaths grew so quickly that the city struggled to manage the crisis. At first, families tried to bury their loved ones in traditional cemeteries, but as the plague intensified, burial grounds filled beyond their limits. Workers responsible for handling the dead could no longer keep up with the rising number of bodies. Authorities began organizing emergency burial efforts. Large pits were dug outside the city walls to hold thousands of victims. Groups of laborers carried bodies through the streets, often covering their faces with cloth in a desperate attempt to avoid infection. Even these workers sometimes died from the disease. As more people fell ill, fewer remained healthy enough to perform essential tasks. Food delivery slowed. Shops closed. Public services began to collapse. The government attempted to maintain order, but the situation grew worse with each passing day. At the height of the outbreak, some ancient accounts suggested that as many as 10,000 people were dying every day in Constantinople. While historians debate the exact number, there is no doubt that the death toll was enormous. The plague had become one of the deadliest disasters the city had ever faced. Even the imperial palace was not safe from the disease. When Justinian I fell ill with the plague, fear spread across the empire. The emperor had spent years trying to restore the strength of the Roman world. His armies had fought long wars to reclaim lost territories in Italy and North Africa. If Justinian died during the crisis, the empire might descend into political chaos. For several days, his condition was uncertain. Court officials waited anxiously, wondering whether the ruler would survive. Fortunately for the empire, Justinian eventually recovered. But many of his closest advisors, servants, and officials were not as fortunate. Death had reached every level of society. Meanwhile, the disease continued spreading beyond the capital. Ships leaving Constantinople carried the infection to new regions. Fleas living on rats traveled quietly within cargo and supplies, spreading the plague wherever ships docked. Cities across the Mediterranean soon reported similar outbreaks. Ports in Syria and Egypt experienced waves of sickness. Trade centers in North Africa began to suffer the same terrifying symptoms. From there, the plague traveled further into Europe and the Middle East. Entire regions began to feel the impact. The world that had already been weakened by the mysterious dimming of the sun in 536 now faced a second devastating blow. In rural villages, the consequences were especially severe. Farmers who became sick could not plant or harvest crops. Fields remained empty. Livestock wandered without care. Food shortages grew worse as agricultural production declined. Communities that had already struggled through years of poor harvests now found themselves facing both famine and disease. For many people, survival became the only priority. Religious leaders tried to comfort frightened populations. Churches held constant prayers asking for divine mercy. Some people believed the plague was a punishment for human sins. Others thought the strange darkening of the sun years earlier had been a warning of coming disaster. To many observers, it felt as if the world itself had entered a time of judgment. Despite the fear and suffering, some individuals continued working bravely to help others. Doctors attempted treatments even though they often failed. Religious leaders cared for the sick and dying. Burial workers risked their lives each day to remove bodies from the streets. These efforts did not stop the plague, but they showed the resilience of human communities even during the darkest moments. Over time, the outbreak in Constantinople slowly began to weaken. The number of new cases gradually declined. The city began to breathe again after months of terror. But the damage had already been done. A massive portion of the population had died. Entire neighborhoods were half empty. Businesses struggled to reopen because so many workers were gone. And across the empire, similar stories were unfolding. The plague did not disappear completely after that first wave. Instead, it would return again and again over the coming decades. Each new outbreak would remind people of the fragile world they now lived in. The mysterious darkened sun of 536 had begun a chain of disasters. First came climate change and famine. Then came the plague. And together these events reshaped the history of the 6th century. But the long-term consequences of this crisis were only beginning to appear. Empires weakened. Trade networks shifted. And the balance of power across Europe, Africa, and Asia slowly began to change. When the first terrible wave of plague finally began to slow in Constantinople, the city that remained behind looked very different from the one that had existed before the disaster. For months, the streets had been filled with death. Now they were filled with silence. Many houses stood empty. Doors hung open where families had once lived. Entire neighborhoods had lost large portions of their population, leaving buildings abandoned and markets half deserted. The city had survived the outbreak, but it had been deeply wounded. Merchants who returned to their shops discovered that many of their customers were gone. Workshops that once employed dozens of workers now struggled to find even a few laborers. The sudden loss of people created unexpected problems throughout the empire. For centuries, the strength of the Byzantine world had depended on its large population. Farmers produced food, workers built cities, soldiers defended borders, and merchants carried goods between distant lands. Now many of those people were gone. Fields in rural regions were left without farmers to plant crops. In some villages, entire households had died, leaving land untended. Agriculture slowed dramatically. Food production dropped even further, making the already fragile food supply even more unstable. The empire's leadership tried to respond to the crisis. Emperor Justinian I issued new orders aimed at stabilizing the economy and encouraging people to return to work. But recovery was slow. You cannot replace millions of lives quickly. Children who survived would take years to grow into workers and farmers. Communities needed time to rebuild families, farms, and businesses. The plague had changed the structure of society. Some survivors unexpectedly found themselves inheriting property or land because so many relatives had died. Others suddenly had opportunities to take jobs that had once been held by people above them in social rank. Labor became more valuable. In certain places, workers could demand better wages because there were fewer people available to do the work. These changes slowly shifted the balance of power between landowners and laborers. But while society attempted to rebuild, the plague was not finished with the world. The disease did not vanish completely after its first appearance. Instead, it returned again and again over the following decades. Each new outbreak brought fresh waves of illness and death. Cities that had only begun to recover suddenly found themselves facing the same nightmare again. The plague traveled along trade routes across the Mediterranean and into Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Many regions experienced repeated epidemics throughout the 6th and 7th centuries. The historian Procopius wrote that the disease seemed to sweep across the world again and again, striking different regions at different times. Communities lived in constant uncertainty. Just when people began to believe the worst was over, the plague could return. This repeated cycle of disease had enormous long-term effects on the Byzantine Empire. Military campaigns became harder to sustain. Armies needed soldiers, and the plague had killed many of them. Taxes became more difficult to collect because fewer farmers and merchants remained alive to produce wealth. The ambitious dream of restoring the full power of the Roman Empire began to fade. Even though Justinian had achieved remarkable victories earlier in his reign, the empire now struggled simply to maintain stability. The combination of climate disruption, famine, and repeated plague outbreaks had weakened the state. Beyond the Byzantine world, other regions also experienced dramatic changes. In Europe, many communities became smaller as populations declined. Some settlements were abandoned completely. Forests slowly reclaimed farmland that had once been carefully cultivated. Archaeologists studying this period have found evidence of shrinking populations in many areas of the continent. In parts of Scandinavia and northern Europe, entire farming communities disappeared during the decades following the strange year of 536. Historians believe the cold climate and poor harvests caused by the dimmed sun may have started the decline. Then the arrival of plague made the situation even worse. But while some regions struggled, others adapted. Human societies are remarkably resilient. Even after disasters that kill millions, people slowly rebuild their lives. New villages appear. Trade routes reopen. Children grow up in a world shaped by the memories of crisis, but still capable of hope. Over time, the sky itself also began to recover. The strange haze that had dimmed the sun gradually faded as volcanic dust slowly settled out of the atmosphere. Sunlight became stronger again. Seasons returned to a more familiar rhythm. Warmer summers allowed crops to grow more reliably. Yet the world that emerged from this long crisis was not the same as the one that had existed before 536. The dim sun years had triggered a chain reaction of disasters. First came climate disruption, then famine, then the devastating pandemic known as the Plague of Justinian. Together, these events reshaped the political and economic systems of the ancient world. Some historians believe this period marked one of the turning points between the ancient era and the early medieval world. Empires weakened. Populations declined. New powers slowly began to rise in the centuries that followed. And all of it may have begun with the mysterious event that darkened the sky in 536. A year when the sun seemed to fade. A year when the climate of the planet suddenly shifted. A year that many historians now consider one of the worst in human history. But the story of that strange year is not finished yet. Scientists in the modern world have spent decades trying to uncover exactly what caused the dimming of the sun. Volcanoes, ice cores, ancient tree rings, and historical records have all provided clues. The deeper researchers look into the past, the more fascinating the mystery becomes. Because the darkness that began in 536 was not just a historical legend. It was a real global event that left traces across the entire planet. And understanding what happened may help us better understand how fragile the balance of Earth's climate can be. For centuries after the strange events of the 6th century, people remembered the years of darkness mostly through stories, scattered chronicles, and fragile historical records. The memory of the dim sun slowly turned into something almost legendary. Many later generations heard about a time when the sky grew pale and the climate changed, but few truly understood what had happened. It was not until the modern scientific age that researchers began to uncover the hidden evidence of this mysterious period. Historians studying ancient writings found repeated references to the same strange phenomenon. Writers living in different parts of the world all described unusual skies, cold weather, and failing harvests during the same years. One of the most important accounts came from Procopius, who had lived during the reign of Justinian I. Procopius described the sun shining without brightness, like the moon, during the year 536. According to his writings, this strange dim light lasted for more than a year and was followed by cold summers and poor harvests. For a long time, historians debated whether such descriptions might have been exaggerated. Ancient writers sometimes used dramatic language when describing natural disasters, and without scientific measurements, it was difficult to confirm their observations. But as new methods of scientific research developed, investigators discovered surprising evidence hidden in the natural world. One of the most powerful tools for studying ancient climate is the examination of ice cores. In places like Greenland and Antarctica, enormous glaciers have preserved layers of ice that formed thousands of years ago. Each year, snow falls and slowly compresses into ice, creating layers that trap tiny particles from the atmosphere. These layers act like pages in a natural history book. Scientists drilling deep into glaciers can extract long cylinders of ice that contain records of past climates. When researchers analyzed ice cores covering the 6th century, they discovered something remarkable. Inside the layers of ice corresponding to the year 536 were large amounts of volcanic particles. These microscopic fragments of ash and sulfur had been carried high into the atmosphere by a massive volcanic eruption. Eventually, they spread across the globe before slowly falling back to Earth. When such eruptions occur, they can inject enormous amounts of sulfur dioxide into the upper atmosphere. This gas forms tiny reflective particles that scatter sunlight. The result is a temporary cooling of the planet. Modern scientists call this phenomenon a volcanic winter. The evidence in the ice cores strongly suggested that one or more enormous volcanic eruptions occurred around the year 536. But that was not the only clue. Researchers also studied tree rings from ancient forests around the world. Trees grow by adding a new ring of wood each year. When conditions are warm and favorable, the rings grow thick. When conditions are cold or stressful, the rings become narrow. By examining tree rings from the 6th century, scientists discovered an unusual pattern. Many trees showed extremely narrow rings beginning around 536 and continuing for several years afterward. This pattern appeared in trees across Europe, Asia, and North America. It suggested that the climate had suddenly become colder worldwide. The evidence matched the descriptions written by ancient historians. Something dramatic had happened to the Earth's atmosphere during that year. Further studies suggested that the eruption responsible for the dimmed sun may have occurred somewhere in the northern hemisphere, possibly in Iceland or another volcanic region. Some researchers believe that multiple eruptions may have occurred within a short period of time. If several large volcanoes erupted close together, the amount of ash and sulfur released into the atmosphere could have been enormous. This would explain why the strange haze lasted for so long. Historical records also describe unusual events in the years that followed. In parts of China, chronicles mention summer snow and crop failures. European sources describe famine and cold weather. Irish records refer to years when bread was scarce. Taken together, these pieces of evidence reveal a global climate crisis that lasted for several years. But the consequences did not stop with the climate. The cooling temperatures weakened agricultural systems across many regions. Food shortages and famine made populations more vulnerable to disease. When the plague of Justinian appeared a few years later, the world was already struggling. Malnutrition weakens the immune system, making it easier for infections to spread. Cities with poor food supplies and weakened populations were far less able to resist the deadly plague. In this way, the strange volcanic events of 536 may have indirectly contributed to one of the most devastating pandemics of the ancient world. The chain of disasters that followed the darkened sun changed the course of history. The empire ruled by Justinian was never quite the same again. Population losses weakened the military and economy. Ambitious plans to restore the full Roman Empire became much harder to maintain. Meanwhile, other regions of Europe and Asia experienced long-term social and political changes. Many historians today believe the crisis of the 6th century helped shape the transition from the ancient world into the medieval era. The dim sun of 536 was not just a strange natural event. It was the beginning of a cascade of disasters that reshaped civilizations. Yet even after uncovering these clues, many mysteries still remain. Exactly which volcano erupted first? How many eruptions occurred? And why did the climate effects last so long? Scientists continue searching for answers hidden in glaciers, ancient trees, and archaeological sites around the world. The deeper they look into the past, the clearer one truth becomes. The year the sun disappeared was not a myth. It was a real moment in history when the balance of nature suddenly shifted, changing the lives of millions of people across the planet. By the mid-500s, the world was slowly beginning to recover from the immediate horrors of the plague, but the scars left by the years of darkness and disease were profound. Entire populations had been reduced, trade networks disrupted, and agriculture weakened. The political and social structures of many regions were permanently altered. In Constantinople, dead or relocated. Despite the devastation, Emperor Justinian I continued recording the events of these years. Writers like Procopius,